Welcome back. This is part 2 of the final video. This is gender appropriation, behavior, and discrimination. So the first thing we're going to do is I just want you to take a look at Blizzard's harassment policy. I'm going to explain a little bit later why I want you to take a look at it, but if you wouldn't mind, I'm not going to read the whole thing to you, but just look at some of these behaviors and look at the consequences for them. Keep these in mind. Try to sink in as many as you can, and especially anything you see in regards to gender or sexuality. The reason we're doing this is because the entire purpose of this video is to answer the question of what are the appropriate behaviors for gender, for both of the genders in World of Warcraft. And in order to do that, we need to look at what are the appropriate assumed behaviors and what are the appropriate functional behaviors. So this first bit is going to be detailing the appropriate assumed behaviors of males and females. And what you're going to be looking at now are some examples of discrimination. I don't want to actually read these out loud. So if you would, you see my cursor just went to the bottom left screen there. That's the chat box. If you would just keep your eyes on the chat box and read whatever I put my cursor over. These were all taken roughly within a month and a half, maybe 2 months of each other, and I didn't play a terrible amount of time either. So this indicates to me that this is a very common presence, and what you should notice, what should jump right out to you, is that discrimination is frowned upon and supposedly enforced, if you read that Blizzard release there on harassment. But the lines of what Blizzard Entertainment considers discrimination and the line of what the player considers discrimination are pretty different, as you can see. To this end, Blizzard doesn't really do an adequate job of enforcing punishment for discrimination against race, gender, or sexuality in World of Warcraft, and that's based on their own guidelines. So these are not, some sort of socially accepted hierarchy, system of morality. This is their own guidelines. They don't really enforce, and this is answering sort of the question of assumed gender roles and what is assumed appropriate. And based on what you're seeing here, discrimination is assumed appropriate because Blizzard themselves have proved inept at combating it. They seem to not think it's a problem, and since they don't think it's a problem, the players, therefore, don't find it to be a problem either. So it has seeped into the social fabric of this video game and is pretty common, as you can see here. The next thing I want to look at is, again, there's a little belly dance thing. We also need to talk about the functional differences of genders and what is functionally appropriate for genders, for either of the genders in World of Warcraft. And what I mean by functionally is assumed is, going back to discrimination, assumed is on the part of the player base, what they assume is appropriate based on one gender or another. Functional is more how the genders actually behave, not so much their rhetoric or their social constructs or social web involving each other. This is how the genders actually behave, is what we're looking at here in just a moment. And in order to do that, we're going to be looking at a theory that I brought up in some earlier videos of this series where I talked about tanks versus healers. So this is player versus everyone. My theory was that tanks tend to be male and healers tend to be female. So I wanted to obviously test this question of tanks and healers because I think it's incredibly relevant to looking at the functional assumptions of in terms of gender appropriation, both on the player base and on Blizzard's part as well. So what you're looking at now is 10 little snapshots. This first guy's in bear form, so I'm actually going to go to the armory here and just show you he's actually male. The first 5 are all male tanks, and these are just 10 random dungeons. The second 5 are all female healers. I did these dungeons all within the span of about 24 hours, and these were just the first 10 I popped into. This was not an effort to find these genders. This was the trend I noticed. I told you guys about it, and here it is. Here's the proof. This is a huge trend. Of course, me being the tank as Jalia obviously offsets that trend. But this is, in terms of just falling into it randomly, this is the trend, and this is incredibly indicative of that theory that we mentioned earlier. And this also highlights the functional acceptance, the functional gender appropriation, that it is acceptable for a female avatar to be a nurturing, caring role, and it is acceptable for a male avatar to be a big, brawny guy that protects you from danger. So this is answering the question of what is acceptable gender behavior in World of Warcraft. We answered that question first by looking at discrimination. So rhetorically, socially, what is acceptable is it's really almost no holds barred in terms of misogyny, in terms of racism, in terms of sexism. There's in terms of homophobia, there's almost no ceiling on how despicable the rhetoric is and can be in this game without any sort of repercussion on the part of Blizzard Entertainment. The second part of this question, what is acceptable, is the functional one. And we've seen here that in player versus player, which we saw in the last video, it is acceptable to kill females more than you kill males. That's just part of the game. And we've seen in player versus everyone that it is now acceptable as well that females should be the nurturing, caring ones and males should be the protective force. All of this may seem incredibly arbitrary or incredibly obvious, but trust me, it goes a long way to explaining the gender differences in World of Warcraft. So in the next video we're going to look at is going to sort of back some of these theories up outside of my own research. The next video is all other people's research. So I will see you there next time.